News, Chattanooga's news, talk, and sports leader.
News Talk 1240.
Welcome to day one of the USA Freedom Act having been passed. So what's changed, really? Nothing. Yep, that was easy. Goodbye. No, it's just so dumb how people thought that there would be any change at all with the USA Freedom Act having been passed, and there's really nothing has changed at all. It's exactly the same as it has been for the last, how long has it been now? Since 2001. Since the last 14 years. Pretty much everything is exactly the same as it has been for the last 14 years. This is same thing, same song, different dance, basically. It's exactly the same thing as we had before. Well, now they're talking about how the USA Freedom Act is protecting us now from all these different government oversights and such. And there's been a lot of overstep of authority when it comes to the Patriot Act. There's no doubting that. The Patriot Act itself was kind of an overstep of authority anyway. I'm not sure where the senators got off on passing it in the first place. How did that ever even come up for a vote would be my question to any congressman who ever voted for it or was in Congress when it was being passed. That really should be the question that we're asking when it comes to the Patriot Act, when it comes to the USA Freedom Act. Either one is, how could you vote on that? How could you vote for that knowing what's in it? Right, like what's in the USA Freedom Act. You know what's in the Patriot Act. I'm assuming they read it. I did. I read the USA Freedom Act. Well, I didn't read all of it. I skimmed through it. I'll be honest. I skimmed through bits of it, looking at different keywords, and I read whole pages where there were keywords that I was looking for, because I was mostly looking at the NSLs, the National Security Letter sections. It's a big thing. It's going to take a while to scour through it, but eventually I will have it all read. So I've not read it in its entirety, and I can understand why a lot of these senators don't actually read the bills. I'm not saying that I'm glad that they don't. I'm saying I understand why they don't, because it's very, very difficult actually to read some of these bills. They're very, very legalese. It's like a foreign language. You sort of have to scour through. Well, how could anyone support either of those bills, the Patriot Act or the USA Freedom Act, which doesn't give us any extra freedoms? I'm not sure what that was supposed to be about, right? The USA Freedom Act, why is it called that? It's not free. There's nothing free about it, really. We have to pay for it, for one. Like, tax money goes towards that. If you pay taxes, your tax money is going towards the USA Freedom Act. Even if you don't pay taxes voluntarily, you're still paying sales tax, tariffs, what have you, excise taxes that are going towards the USA Freedom Act and the enforcement of the Patriot Act, which is no more, of course. You're still paying for that, right? So that's not really free. It's not really free. So I guess it's true. USA Freedom isn't free because we keep having to pay for it with our tax dollars. Well, the Fourth Amendment, of course, guarantees us the protections from unreasonable searches and seizures, which is to say every search and seizure that takes place that does not have a warrant backing it is unreasonable, thus is illegal. Well, the right of the people is the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That's not hard to read, right? Like, I'm not a college graduate. I didn't go to school. I can't read my own name, right? No, but I really, though, I didn't go to college. I'm not an English major. I didn't study literature, but I can read that and I know what it says. It's pretty easy, actually. So most of these college grads, most of these guys in Congress are college grads. So we can have a pretty good idea that they can read. Sorry, that was my cell phone. We have a pretty good idea that these people are able to read. So that being the case, how come they can't actually read the Fourth Amendment and see, oh man, this bill that I have to vote for or against is against the Fourth Amendment? Wow. For some reason they're not really recognizing that fact, oddly enough. So it's very, very strange that nobody's really wanting to admit that the Patriot Act is just blatantly illegal. It's not just that it's a violation of our Fourth Amendment, which it is, of course, but it's illegal. Like, it's blatantly illegal. Well, NSA reform and all that sort of thing is a very hot button issue right now. Everyone's talking about it, and hopefully I can offer a little bit of a different perspective on it, because nobody's wanting to admit that it is in fact illegal. It's just flat out illegal. The USA Freedom Act is null and void because it's illegal. There can be no enforcement of it legally because it's not a legal bill. It's not law. It's not legal. Well, the president signed the USA Freedom Act into law on Tuesday, late Tuesday, I should say. The law will temporarily restore the nation's phone bulk metadata collection program until it transitions to telephone providers in 6 months. So we do have that grace period there. So basically, the NSA is still doing exactly what it's been doing for 6 more months. So by the time the next presidential election has already come and passed, there will already be still a bulk collection program, most likely anyway. Well, the president's signature is a significant milestone in a history of controversial decisions related to surveillance, according to TechCrunch. As a presidential candidate, Obama ran on a platform critical of the surveillance practices of the Bush administration, but he received backlash from privacy advocates in the wake of the Snowden revelations for declining to take executive action to rein in the National Security Agency's intelligence practices. Even after his own review group found that the bulk metadata storage program should be reformed, the president called on Congress to determine how the program should be reformed. This resulted in a year and a half of debate over privacy rights and national security that divided political parties and Congress itself. The New York Times noted today that in encouraging Congress to pass the USA Freedom Act, Obama took ownership of the surveillance programs. The White House told the Times the administration believes the president will come out on the right side of history for striking the ideal balance between national security and privacy. Problem is, that's not the proper balance, because they're still offering up to the gods of surveillance our freedoms, right? We're still offering up to the gods of surveillance our liberty, and we're exchanging that liberty in order to obtain security. And we're not supposed to do that. That's actually kind of the opposite of what we're supposed to do. Obviously, some of the founding fathers, and particularly Benjamin Franklin, were very much opposed to that, right? Like, I'm not one who likes to invoke the name of the founding fathers very often, because they're kind of, well, I'm not going to say they're wrong in anything, but they're not really relevant's not the right word either. They're not. People don't really take them seriously anymore, I suppose, is what I should say. Now I do, right? Like I like what they say. I read all that sort of thing in school, but and I still read about different writings that they've made. The Anti-Federalist Papers, I think, are wonderful. Thomas Jefferson's a pretty cool dude and all that sort of thing. But people don't really take that seriously anymore, right? Like if you told John Brennan, the director of the CIA, you're not really taking seriously what the founding fathers said. He'd say, well, that was based on old world politics, and that was based on threats which were existent back in the 1700s, which are completely different from the present day terrorist organizations which are at our doorstep right now. To which I would reply, so what difference does that make? It's still a philosophical argument. The practical application doesn't particularly matter, because it's a philosophical argument against sacrificing liberty in order to obtain security. Thus, surveillance is wrong. Thus, the NSA should be abolished. Thus, all these different surveillance programs that are targeted towards American citizens are illegal. It's as simple as that. They are not legal. Anyone who's working to enforce them is acting outside of the law and is actually guilty of treason at this point. So it's really actually quite simple how these things work. It's not a question of is this the appropriate action at this time regarding terrorism? It's a question of, is this the right thing to do? And it's really not. There's no defending what the NSA is doing. You can't possibly, with any sort of reason or logic, defend what the NSA has done. Well, as the law went into effect on Tuesday, politicians and advocacy group, that's a hard one, weighed in on the controversial bill, which was first introduced in a different form in October of 2013. Response has roughly fallen into three camps: those who approve of the bill but view it as merely a first step, those in favor of the bill who appear to want to leave things as they are now, and those who want to rip up the act and go back to how things were. Well, that's actually inaccurate. That is not the three steps. Rather, those are three camps, but those aren't the main three camps. I want to rip up the USA Freedom Act and not replace it with anything, you see. I don't want there to be a surveillance state. It's as simple as that. I don't want the government to be committing acts of surveillance against U.S. citizens. It's that easy. I don't want them to do that. I don't particularly want the government's protection because they're very bad at it, right? Like I can't think of any instance in recent history where the government's actually really protected any U.S. citizens. I can't think of any example of that. So it's not really appropriate for them to say that this is three camps that we can determine are the three main camps. That's not really true, because there are quite a few people like you or I who think that the Patriot Act and the USA Freedom Act were just wrong altogether. As a whole, they were wrong. So it's quite simple, really, when it comes right down to it. It's so easy that the solution is to just get rid of it and not replace it with anything at all. Well, even with bipartisan praise, concerns remain that the bill does not go far enough and only addresses the bulk collection of Americans' telephone records. Privacy groups and the tech industry fall into this camp. Although they are celebrating the culmination of 2 years of work to reform the phone record program, they took advantage of the media spotlight on NSA reform to remind the public that the Freedom Act does nothing to protect the communications of non-U.S. citizens or communications swept under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And that's something also that needs to be addressed, is that this is referring to U.S. citizens, not anyone else. Now, I know a lot of people don't hold foreigners in very high regard. People, when you talk about, okay, we're collecting the bulk metadata information, or we're collecting all the phone records of Iranians, and they say, well, good. Well, okay, well, what about your average Iranian guy who's just trying to get by? What about all the Christians in Iran who are, again, just trying to get by? Should we be collecting their phone records too? Should we be treating them like third-rate citizens? Should we be treating them like non-humans? Obviously, the answer is no. These people just want to be left alone. These are just your average people, right? These are just regular old guys who don't want to be bothered. I don't want to be bothered. I'm walking down the street, I'm making a phone call, I don't want to be bothered. It's a primal want to not be bothered. It's a primal thing. We all just want to be left alone. And some of us, have that sort of messed up, and we want to mess with other people, and those people are called politicians, but most of us just want to be left alone. And when it comes right down to it, that's pretty much most people. We just want to be left alone. So why do we keep bothering other people and saying that it's justice, or saying it's the right thing to do, or saying that this is A-okay? Why do we keep doing that? Why do we keep shooting other people because of different socioeconomic beliefs, or because of different religious views, or what have you? Why do we keep doing that? Well, it's because we have this odd idea that we're better than everybody else, and somehow, right? Like we're all somehow we are collectively better than everyone else because we are who we are. Is essentially the argument. We are who we are, thus we are better. And that's such a fallacy. It's such a wrong way to think. It's so ridiculous that so many people keep thinking this way, where it's okay to look at the bulk metadata collection, or it's okay to spy on people's phone records if they're in the UK, right? Or if they're in Canada, or if they're in Mexico, or if they're in Iran or Syria, or if they're in Algeria, or if they're in Russia. It's okay to look at their phone records. But if you look at Americans' phone records, it's wrong. Where does the divide begin? So if you're an American citizen, you have all these extra protections somehow. But if you're not, then you don't. That's not how things are supposed to work. You have rights no matter who you are or where you are. You can have rights in Canada just as you have rights here in the States. You have rights in Mexico just as you have rights here in the States. The Constitution doesn't give you anything. It doesn't give you any rights. It's just formal recognition of rights which pre-existed. Right? Like we hold these things to be true, as an example. So it's not that they're trying to take away our rights, because they can't do that. They're trying to stop recognizing our rights. It's a very big difference, a very, very big difference between it going away and them not recognizing it. I'll give you, here's a practical example. You're driving down the road and you get pulled over. Oh, gee, man, you got pulled over. Well, what am I going to do now? Well, you pull over. You're a regular guy. You don't want to be bothered. So you pull over, and the policeman walks up to your window, rolls down your window, and you roll down your window, and he says, "Do you know how fast you were going?" And so you're a smarter kind of person because you're listening to Hot News Talk Radio. You're a smarter kind of person, so you say, "Well, I don't need to answer that." And so he gets all up in your face and says, "You are going to answer that because it's against the law not to." And you say, well, no, it's not. I have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. No matter if I've been arrested or not, I'm not going to answer that question. Well, then he pulls out this sheet of paper that was just passed in the Tennessee legislature that ceases to recognize the Fifth Amendment. And actually now the law is that you must reply to a policeman when spoken to. Does that mean that now suddenly you don't have Fifth Amendment rights? Does that mean now suddenly you don't have the right to remain silent and you don't have protection against self-incrimination? Well, of course not. This is just a piece of paper. It doesn't represent anything other than the legislature's lack of respect for individual rights. That's all it represents. And the policeman, of course, represents awful tyrannical rule, but that's always the case anyway. So that's exactly the case that we have here, where it's on a much broader scale, where the federal government or the federative government over in Russia or the parliament over in the UK, it doesn't matter, any government ceases to recognize some right. It doesn't mean that it's gone away. Okay, as an example, you have First Amendment rights here in the United States, right? Like, we call them First Amendment rights, but it's really deeper than that. It's your right to free speech. It's not just a First Amendment right. Really, it should only be referred to as a First Amendment right if you're talking about it legally, but you have a right to free speech no matter where you are. So I say, I don't like the government here in the United States. I think it's wrong, and I think taxation is immoral, and I think that that policemen are constantly doing things only for purposes of revenue collection, and I think all of that is wrong, and I think perhaps something should be done about that in terms of voting out these different politicians. Well, you have a right to say that, just as I did, and I kind of believe that. So I said that, and I have a right to say that. Well, okay, so you go down to, let's create a new country. Oh, or not. You go to Cuba. You say exactly the same thing. You say, man, the Cuban government really doesn't represent me very well. I think Raul Castro is a tyrant, and I think the Cuban military is doing a very poor job of protecting the people. And really, we should normalize relations with every country and have free trade and a free market here in the Cuban Republic, or I don't remember what they call it. Maybe it's the People's Republic of Cuba. Anyway, in the nation which is commonly referred to as Cuba. Well, you have a right to say that in Cuba, just as you do in the United States. However, Mr. Castro will probably send some soldiers over there to arrest you. Well, you still have a right to say that. It's just that you don't have that right recognized in Cuba. You still have that right, but it's not recognized there. That's the difference. Fortunately, for the most part, at least some of the rules that are, or some of the rights that are recognized in the Constitution are still relatively well recognized and are still relatively well protected, on all not very much. Most people, though, will recognize that you have a right to free speech. Although my favorite thing that people do is you have a right to free speech, but that little but on the end, every end has a but. They always do that. They say you have a right to free speech, but, and it ends there. Okay, you have a right to free speech, but you can't say da 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 da. You have a right to free speech, but you can't say fire in a crowded movie theater. Well, sure I could. Of course I could. What's the context? Is it a joke? I'm standing on a stage in this theater. I'm a stand-up comedian. I hope that never happens, but I'm a stand-up comedian. And I say out to the audience, there's these guys who are just so obnoxious, the kind of guys who go, fire, in a movie theater. Well, I've just shouted fire in a movie theater. Guess what happens? The audience probably doesn't laugh because it's not a very, very funny joke, but I'm not going to be arrested and hauled off for shouting fire in a crowded movie theater. However, if I shouted fire in a crowded movie theater and somebody trod upon somebody else and killed them by trampling them in the panic to get out of the theater, even though there was no fire, I could be sued for wrongful death, and I could certainly have a bunch of charges pressed against me, but not for the act of saying fire. It was for what happened after that. See, I have a right to say that, but I also have to face the consequences afterwards. So you definitely do have a right to say fire in a crowded movie theater. That whole fallacy is ridiculous. You have a right to say it. It's just that you have to face ramifications for anything you said. That's just always the case anyway, right? So your right to say it doesn't go away, but other people have a right to sue you if something terrible happens to them because of what you've said, you see. So that's sort of the fallacy that we keep seeing. And it drives me nuts when people say you have a right to free speech, but, or you have the right to bear arms, but, and it just drives me nuts. Well, something that doesn't drive me nuts is really good prices. I hate paying too much for stuff, especially cars. I'll look at prices of cars and I think, this car is expensive. What the heck, man? Why is this car $30,000 for a Fiat 500? This is nuts. Well, Automax, you don't have to bother with that. It's a nice little car lot where top quality cars are $200, $2,000 or less sometimes than other lots. And Louis has an unpretentious little car lot just east of Central High on Highway 58. It's low overhead, no staff. He does everything himself right down to washing the cars, and he's passing the savings on to you. Everyone can get a car and rebuild credit. That's Automax at 643-2886. Ask for Louis. That's Automax at 643-2886. And tell him that you heard about his car lot right here on Hot News Talk Radio, AM 1240. And this is AM 1240 Hot News Talk Radio. We're everywhere. Listen live to Hot News Talk Radio at hotnewstalkradio.com. Download the TuneIn Radio app and search for Hot News Talk Radio. Hot News Talk Radio is on Twitter, where you report, the world decides. It's AM 1240. Hot News Talk Radio. You can save half off right now. Go to hotnewstalkradio.com and click on the half off link for great deals. Hot News Talk Radio is saving you money. That's AM 1240 at Hot News Talk Radio. We have a lot of different items up there on hotnewstalkradio.com. We actually have a Jeep Grand Cherokee up for sale right now for a very low price. So definitely check that out on hotnewstalkradio.com and click on the half off link. You know, a really good show about local economy and free markets is Nuganomics.com with David Toulis. I listen to his show every day, and it's just, he never ceases to amaze with his really precise and in-tune analysis of the free markets and especially our local economy here in Chattanooga, where he's been positing different things that most people wouldn't even think of, like how we should buy local instead of national because the national economy is bound to collapse. Nuganomics.com with David Toulis.
This is a mob mode. This is the mob mode. What kind of fool do you think I am? Just think I know nothing of
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
News Talk 1240.
Hi, this is your computer speaking. I don't feel so well. It's like I've come down with a bug, and I'm getting slower.
Affordable Computers. We fix sick computers. Your hometown guys at Affordable Computers will repair your PC in half the time of the big boys at an affordable price. No tricks, no gimmicks, no computer speak technobabble. Just good, quick, and courteous affordable service and repairs. Want to affordably supercharge your PC? Affordable Computers on Highway 58. Affordable Computers hand builds all desktops in-house. If you're looking for a better-than-new refurb laptop, $150 will get you a Dell or another name brand at Affordable Computers. Affordable Computers, Highway 58, between Arby's and Taco Bell. Also Fort O, Battlefield Parkway, near Holcomb's. Affordable Computers, we service what we sell. Call 499-1975. That's 499-1975.
Wow, this is amazing. I'm feeling great. Supercharged.
Do you feel better outside your home or business than in? Indoor air quality is important. Mildew, mold, smoke, water, and rodent damage are prime causes of poor indoor air quality. Ducts Indoor Air Professionals, better known as Duct Busters, cleans HVAC systems using 127 definable Duct Busters steps. Let Mark Thompson address the indoor air quality at your business to help reduce employee illnesses. Prevent fires by cleaning your dryer vents. Mark and his parents, Dick and Joan Thompson, have been building our local economy and helping local people with HVAC systems 16 years. Ducts Indoor Air Professionals. Call 876-9907. 876-9907. Ducks. Call now.
We've got a table here at Delia's in Saudi Daisy, ready to delight in a plate of authentic Mexican food. Delia's spreads a rich selection, loaded nachos, crazy chicken, homemade tamales, maybe the enchiladas with beef, chicken, pork, quesadillas, every dish beautifully pictured on the menu to help us decide. Join us for lunch or dinner. We're at Delia's in Saudi Daisy on Dayton Pike near the Thrasher Light. Here's dinner. Delia's uses the freshest ingredients, cooked to perfection. Nachos, homemade. Delia's open every day except the Lord's Day. For lunch and dinner, treat yourself to Delia's genuine Mexican food. In Saudi, call 521-7145. That's 521-7145.
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
News Talk 1240.
You love your hometown. Are you interested in free markets, in local economy? Do you hope that Chattanooga can survive the next meltdown, the next chain of disasters in the national economy? What's the best way to live out the ideals of self-government and self-determination? Join me, David Toulis, weekdays 1 to 3.
Hot News Talk 1240.
Love your neighbor, buy local.
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
Hot News Talk 1240.
Fox News Radio. I'm Lillian Wu. More beach closures in Southern California as officials try to track the source of tar balls on Long Beach.
Crews were out until around 4 a.m. this morning, picking up some of these large-sized tar balls. Questions are being asked about whether this could be linked in any way to that huge pipeline leak north of Santa Barbara, some 100 miles or so from here.
Fox's Jonathan Hunt. Hundreds of thousands responding to a 9/11 first responders plea for help on Facebook. A retired firefighter robbed of the helmet he wore on 9/11.
I want the helmet back to signify what I went through, not just in my career, but really what signifies that day.
Michael O'Connell saying he was stunned by the number of times his post was shared, about 245,000 so far, many of them helping scour the internet for his helmet, and the number of people filing for first-time jobless help last week down to 276,000. Fox News, we report, you decide.
You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, we'll give you Chattanooga and the world.
News Talk 1240.
Well, don't worry. There's still a lot going on that's not involving surveillance. I know it's sort of been the big issue in just the last few, I guess, weeks, months, years, whatever. Surveillance has really been what most of everyone's been talking about, but there's still a lot more going on that's not referring necessarily to the broader surveillance state. In fact, WikiLeaks has just come out with something that's indicative of yet more deep, dark, terrible things going on regarding Trans-Pacific partnerships and the Trans-Pacific pipeline and so on. So WikiLeaks has released a secret TISA doc, that's TISA, the more evil sibling of TTIP and TPP. So WikiLeaks has released 17 secret documents from the negotiations of the Global Trade in Services Agreement, or TISA, which have been taking place behind closed doors, largely unnoticed since 2013. The main participants are, of course, the United States, the European Union, and 23 other countries, including Turkey, Mexico, Canada, Australia, Pakistan, Taiwan, and Israel, of course, which together comprise 2/3 of global GDP. Significantly, all the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are absent and are therefore unable to provide their perspective and input for what is essentially a deal designed by Western nations for the benefit of Western corporations. According to the European Commission's dedicated page, TISA aims at opening up markets and improving rules in areas such as licensing, financial services, telecoms, e-commerce, maritime transport, and professionals moving abroad temporarily to provide services. TISA's focus on services complements the two other global trade agreements currently being negotiated in secret, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, and the corresponding deal for the Pacific region, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTP, of course, which deal with goods and investments. Like both TTIP and TPP, one of the central aims of TISA is to remove barriers to trade in services and to impose a regulatory ratchet on participating nations. In the case of TISA, the ratchet ensures that the services are deregulated and open up to private companies around the world, and that once privatized, it cannot be renationalized. Well, that's all fine and dandy, except how about this? Stop nationalizing companies. Stop having state-owned companies. It's as simple as that. Wow, that was a wonderful new solution that nobody's ever thought of before. Except, wait, having a nationalized company is actually kind of a new-ish idea as of like late 1700s, mid-1800s, I would say. Whenever, it predates Karl Marx. There may have been some sort of nationalized service back in the Holy Roman Empire way back in the day, but as it is, it's really just a terrible, terrible thing that we have here, where we keep seeing all these different companies and such getting special favor from the government, and that's not how it's supposed to be. Think about it this way. People keep talking about how this or that isn't fair. GM, it wasn't fair. GM couldn't compete or such and such. Well, the government bailed out GM, obviously, and most people were highly opposed to that. Well, that's fine and dandy as well, but really we should be opposed to any kind of government intervention regarding a business. There should be no government intervention towards businesses unless that business has, of course, been found to be conducting some sort of illegal activity, and then the CEO can be prosecuted. That's a whole nother story. But when it comes down to the government giving money to businesses to prop them up, well, that's hardly fair, is it? That's not creating a fair market, a free market. Well, In-Q-Tel is one great example of that people don't usually think of. In-Q-Tel, it's in Arlington, Virginia, in the States, is a not-for-profit venture capital firm that invests in high-tech companies for the sole purpose of keeping the CIA and other intelligence agencies equipped in the latest information technology in support of United States intelligence capability. Now, that's a direct quote from Wikipedia, which gathers all of that information from one main source, which was In-Q-Tel Incorporated company information from Hoover.com, I believe. No, yeah, hoovers.com/company information, company profile, In-Q-Tel. So these things are all, of course, backed up by different sources, and you can check sources, and you can be clear on whether or not this source is trustworthy or not. But originally, In-Q-Tel was called Peleus, perhaps back in the day. And now it's known as In-Q-Tel. It was launched in 1999 under the direction of Gilman Louie. In-Q-Tel's mission was to identify and invest in companies developing cutting-edge technologies that serve United States national security interests. So this has been going on since way before 9/11, by the way. A lot of people think that everything changed with 9/11, or everything changed with the Bush administration, or everything changed with maybe the Reagan administration, what have you. No, things have been terrible since basically forever. So, that's no new concern. That's kind of the thing that bothers me as well when we talk about different surveillance operations and what have you. This didn't start with any one president. We can't point at any one president and say this guy's to blame, right? Like, we can't point at President Obama today and say you are to blame for the NSA. No, the NSA is to blame for the NSA. Lack of oversight is to blame for the NSA. We're almost to blame for the NSA for our apathy, right? We're supposed to be reigning in government, and we're not really doing that. So obviously, we're kind of also to blame for the NSA. So pointing at one unified figure and saying you, the president, are to blame for the NSA is misguided and probably exactly what we were wanted to do anyway. People keep wanting to do that. People want a punching bag. People want one thing to look at and to stick their finger in and say, this is wrong. This is the wrong thing. It doesn't work that way, though. I wish it did. I wish we could point at one guy and say, you are to blame for NSA surveillance. You are to blame for 9/11. You are to blame for the underwear bomber. You're to blame for Waco. You can't really point a finger at any one person and blame them, because it's not one person. It's a network of people. It's meant to be that way anyway, because if you had one person, then if that one person disappears, gets in a car wreck, has a heart attack, falls off a cliff, their brake lines get cut, whatever, then everything collapses. So it can't be one guy. It can't be one unified thing. Otherwise, if something happens to that person and there's no successor, or the successor's not as good as him, or whatever, everything falls apart. That's why we actually have the federal system that we have today. That's why we don't have a king, right? That's why we probably shouldn't have a unified office of an executive branch anyway. I'm not saying that the president himself was an evil person, or George Bush was an evil person, or Reagan was an evil person, although I don't really like any of those people. I'm saying that a unified position where this person has an immense amount of power is never a good thing. You don't want one person with a bunch of power. That never works out well, because, absolute power corrupts absolutely, as has been said many, many times by many different people. It's true, though. You don't want one person having all this power. I mean, Janet Yellen's a fall person, obviously. Janet Yellen's not the one person you want to look at and say you're responsible for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve as a machine is responsible for the Federal Reserve. The government is also responsible for the Federal Reserve. The federal system is responsible for the Federal Reserve. The IMF, all these different international financial institutions, the banks. You can't look at one thing and say this is the problem, because a system is the problem. A very broad, very wide-reaching, very huge, very mechanical, very unfeeling system is the problem. So what's the solution? Well, ignore all of it, actually. Just never mind all of that and go with a local solution instead. Or we keep worrying. We sit in our beds and we stay up all night and we think, man, if this guy gets elected president, we're all screwed. It doesn't really work that way, though. Okay, think about it this way. People were all excited. I remember people were all excited when Bush got elected into office, and they said things are finally going to change. We have a Republican in office. The budget's going to be great. We're not going to get into any dumb wars, and things are going to be great. Okay, the 9/11 happened, and we invaded Afghanistan. People backed that because they thought that was the problem, even though, well, anyway. Then in 2003, we invaded Iraq, and people were like, well, what are we doing here? Although most people in a fervor of patriotism supported it anyway. Tons of people joined the military, yada, yada. Well, those two things happened, and yet we didn't really think that Bush himself was to blame, although a lot of people did. It was a broader system than that. You call it the military-industrial complex. You call it the contractors. You call it all these different things, but the system itself is the problem, not any one person. So getting Mitt Romney in office in 2012 wouldn't have changed anything from the president who's the president now getting in office, right? Like Obama being in office wouldn't be any different from Mitt Romney being in office, and probably is actually better than McCain being in office. And that's just how it is. And besides, the president's in office because people wanted the president to be in office anyway. So I have no right to complain. It's a democratic process, right? Well, 17 documents were released by WikiLeaks regarding the TISA, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Well, it's part of it anyway. It's the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well. And the annex on e-commerce is likely to be of particular interest to Ars Technica readers and listeners to my show Digital Drive, since if it is adopted, it would have major impact on several extremely sensitive areas in the digital realm. As an example, as Ars Technica is very helpfully pointing out, that's arstechnica.com, by the way. They go very in-depth into this. The question of data flow, specifically the flow of European citizens' personal data to the United States, is at the heart of disputes over the European Union's proposed data retention rules, the Safe Harbor Agreement, and the TTIP. So Article 2.1 of TISA's e-commerce annex would impose upon its signatories, no party shall prevent a service supplier of another party from transferring, accessing, processing, or storing information, including personal information, within or outside the party's territory, where such activity is carried out in connection with the conduct of the service supplier's business. What that means is that the European Union would not be allowed to require that United States companies like Google or Facebook keep the personal data of European citizens within the EU. One of the ideas currently floated in Germany. So Article 9.1 imposes a more general ban on requiring companies to locate some of their computing facilities in a territory, saying that no party may require a service supplier as a condition for supplying a service or investing in its territory to use computing facilities located in the party's territory. Now, that's of particular interest, actually, for those who are not wanting to pay U.S. taxes, where a lot of the time different companies have been, I don't know, pressured the right word, but asked nicely to please move their company within the United States so they can pay United States taxes. So this would prevent that from happening. So that actually could be seen as a positive move. I don't want to pay U.S. taxes. You probably don't want to pay U.S. taxes unless you're very patriotic, and good for you. Or you are a company, you own a company, and you don't want to pay federal, corporate taxes. You don't want to bother with that. So this might stop that from happening. Well, back to surveillance, actually, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, is wiretapping and has been wiretapping triple the amount of times that they had been previously in 9 years. And agents are now avoiding federal oversight. Now, the DEA is not an agency I'm fond of. There are many reasons for this. The main one is I think prohibition is stupid, right? Think about it this way. I could be growing marijuana in my backyard. I might be. You don't know, right? You might be. I don't know. And I don't care either. I could be doing that in my backyard. Who cares? So then I'm using it for my own personal use. Maybe I share it with my friends. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But then the DEA finds out and they go, ooh, find out about some revenue. Gonna get some revenue. Gonna arrest this guy and charge him several $1,000s in fines and throw him in jail for 5 years. That's gonna be a good one. You know, and then that happens and I'm thrown in jail. Whereas in other states it's completely legal, but for some reason in Georgia, Tennessee, it's completely illegal to grow my own plant. I can't grow a certain plant because they say I can't. So I get thrown in jail and fined and I get put in prison for a very long time or what have you. That's why I'm against prohibition, because this is completely unreasonable, completely ridiculous, and it's people pushing their own ridiculous sense of they're right and we're wrong on other people. It's them telling us that they're right and we're wrong, even though there's no real proof that they're right. And think about it this way too: you can buy alcohol any old day. But, you know, you grow a plant, get thrown in jail for a long time. So I'm fundamentally opposed to the DEA because they're enforcing ridiculous and immoral practices on otherwise very peaceful people who are really not having any interest in doing any harm to anybody. They just want to enjoy themselves and have a good time. But unfortunately, the Drug Enforcement Administration doesn't particularly like that. They say that it creates a population of lazy people, to which I say, so for every lazy person, there's several other people who are not going to be that. So who cares, really? Well, agents from the DEA conducted 11,681 electronic intercepts in the year 2014. Now, what's the DEA doing with electronic intercepts? Now, remember, the DEA is a Drug Enforcement Administration. So you might think that, well, the DEA is trying to stop Mexicans and Colombians and Cubans from flying marijuana in giant bales and dropping them on some kid in a farm, right, from an airdrop. They're trying to keep that from happening. Well, except that it's actually Americans who they're wiretapping. So I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm not in any way affiliated with a Mexican drug cartel. So I'm not sure where that comes from. And they've conducted 11,681 electronic intercepts in the year 2014. That's up from 3,394 in 2005. The problem is that if the DEA is putting one electronic intercept, that's bad. I don't care if they have 1,000. I don't care if they have 2. 1 is way too many. Well, the DEA attributed the increased use of wiretaps to the corresponding increase of types of devices and methods that drug traffickers use to communicate. Some of the wiretap orders could be counted more than once if they include the collection of both voice calls and text messages, for example, USA Today wrote. Now, what are they using for wiretaps? Obviously, most people don't use landlines anymore. Like, we have a landline here. I can prove it. Check it out. That's a landline. We have a landline right here. In fact, you can call it if you want to. It's 423-800-8949. That's 423-800-8949 if you want to call the landline here at the studio and we can talk. But what difference does it make anyway? That's not really a true wiretap if it's a cell phone. That's more of a wireless tap. That's more of a Stingray capture. Now that's starting to get a little bit weird. Now we know the DEA has Stingray devices. The ACLU has discovered that very kindly for us, so we know that they have them. Stingray devices, of course, are also known as cell site simulators. They're devices that are used to capture voice information, SMS information, location information of a cell phone, of your cell phone, actually, probably, if you were in the Rossville area a few weeks ago, because one was probably used by the Federal Marshal Service to capture Mr. Pam, who was found hiding in a closet. So we're pretty certain that these devices are used pretty much everywhere with a very wide-reaching signal. It makes your cell phone think that it's connecting to a cell tower when in fact it's not. So it's really undetectable. It's almost impossible to discover whether or not you're being tapped with a cell site simulator. The DEA attributed this, of course, to these wiretaps. They won't refer to what the wiretaps are. They just say the wiretaps. Beyond the simple increase in the number of intercepts that the DEA conducted, it seems that the agency is bypassing more stringent federal rules for getting wiretap approval. Could it be? Now this is a bit of a stretch. Okay, we're going to posit something that maybe is a little bit controversial. Maybe may get my brake lines cut. But could it be that the federal government is not following its own rules? Now I know, that's a far out concept that is probably not the case, but we'll posit that anyway. It appears that the DEA may be doing that, but I don't know. The wiretap counts show that in 2005, there were twice as many intercepts approved by federal courts as there were intercepts approved by state courts. So in 2009, there were about as many intercepts approved by federal courts as there were intercepts approved by state courts. And in 2012, the number of intercepts approved by state courts began definitively surpassing those approved by federal courts. So now they're going through the states. State wiretap laws must include all of the safeguards federal law requires. Getting approval to go ahead with the wiretap is generally easier if the DEA makes its case to a state court because states tend to be afraid of the feds. That's just a simple matter. It's a simple fact of life. A policeman is probably going to defer to an FBI agent even if the policeman has jurisdiction and is actually of a higher rank than the FBI agent. That's just how it is. People are afraid of the feds. They're like, well, I don't want to get on the bad side of the feds, to which I say, you already are. They're wiretapping you. Well, although the state wiretap laws must include all those safeguards, it appears that maybe they're not. Well, DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, helpfully sent an email to Ars Technica where Special Agent Joseph Moses wrote, "There are many reasons why state wire intercepts might be conducted during the course of a DEA investigation. One trend over the years is wider growing recognition by state and local prosecutors of the value of evidence obtained from wire intercepts generally, and a corresponding increase in their willingness to move forward with these applications. This dynamic," he says, "coupled with an increase in the number of states that have passed laws allowing for intercepts, has contributed to the rising numbers you note. Furthermore, since DEA offices often support task forces staffed by large numbers of state and local officers, close relationships with the state or local prosecutors who would pursue those wiretaps routinely develop. It is also common for investigations to start at the state or local level and engage federal resources as they grow in complexity and jurisdictional reach, but remain under the control of state or local prosecutors who continue to deploy investigative tools, including wire intercepts." Now, break there. I know this is getting a little bit long-winded, but in all fairness to this DEA special agent, we'll read the one last paragraph he has. "Closely related to this is the development of state laws that may reflect with greater currency the evolving needs of law enforcement in light of technical advances in communications. Given their more recent vintage, these state, I guess this technology is a wine, it now has a vintage. In more recent vintage, these state laws may be more tailored or geared to intercepting particular technologies. That is 18 United States Code 2510 ETSEQ, which was originally passed in 1968 and may trail technology to a greater extent. Note that, passed in 1968, somehow this still has bearing on technology from the year 2015. It might be that lawmakers in 1968 didn't know that we would have telecommunications in the same way that we have them now in the year 2015. Perhaps some review is far overdue. Perhaps it could be that we need a little bit of a review of the law from 1968 that refers to wiretapping. Well, that usually is the case anyway. You see, when laws are passed, they're passed by who? Lawmakers, right? So in the federal jurisdictions, the Congress passes laws. The lawmakers pass laws. Surprise, surprise. Guess what? Most lawmakers, I don't know the average age of a congressman, but it's probably over the age of 102. And these people don't actually know how technology works 99.9% of the time. That being the case, I'm not sure how they're actually qualified to pass any sort of legislation about cell phones when the last telecommunications device they used was a rotary phone. So it's seeming like perhaps the law is a little bit outdated when it comes to wiretaps. Now, that might sound a little bit odd to me because I'm an apologist for the Constitution, which is an extremely old law. The Constitution goes all the way back to the ancient time of 1790 something. So why am I defending that, but not the 1968 wiretap laws? Well, it's quite simple. The 1968 wiretap laws are most likely illegal anyway. You see, the Fourth Amendment is a very general thing. It's a very broad thing, and rightly so. These warrants and these bills are an attempt to sort of narrow that down to one single laser beam of precise wiretapping legislation, which is completely contrary to the Constitution, to our rights. That's why I'm wanting for reform, because any sort of wiretap law that doesn't allow for warrants to be made or allows for wiretaps to take place without there being a warrant is illegal. Guess what? Fourth Amendment doesn't allow for it. So any sort of law such as that is exceptionally illegal, because now it's violating the Constitution and your personal liberties. We definitely don't want that to happen. Well, the best way, of course, to defend our civil liberties is to use them, right? Think about it this way. You have muscles, don't you? Of course you do. That's how you're moving. You have ligaments, you have tendons, you have muscles. But if you don't use them, they atrophy. They cease working. Well, that's sort of what's happening with our right to privacy. We aren't really using it that much because we keep ceding ourselves over to the idea of Facebook and Twitter, and those are fine services, but the government is very fond of them too because the folks in the government really like to spy on our communications. Facebook is, of course, happy to oblige since the folks over at Facebook get tons of federal dollars for it, I'm sure, and they don't want to lose their citizenships over there in the Facebook offices. So it's a very clear symbiotic relationship between the two. The solution, of course, is an operating system like Tails that encrypts our communications and runs it through the Tor network, and different services which are now popping up to make our communications much more secure outside of the influence of the federal government, who really has no jurisdiction over our phone calls anyway. That's the vain part of it. The federal government has no jurisdiction over my phone call from me to you, right? How could they? How can they ever claim that? Just as the federal government has no jurisdiction over the internet. The internet is not a national thing. It has no nation. It's a service that exists around the globe and beyond, even in the International Space Station. This is Digital Drive. I'm your host, Russell, and I'm tired of the federal government and their sick and twisted claims at jurisdiction. Nuganomics.com with David Toulis is coming up in just a few seconds right here on Hot News Talk Radio, the show where David Toulis talks about local economy and free markets in his own very Nuga-centric way. His reverse carpetbagging is how I like to put it, where he's pushing Southern ideals up towards the north of local economy right here on Hot News Talk Radio, AM 1240 and HotNewsTalkRadio.com.
This is a modern world. This is the modern world.